Good morning, everyone. My name is Sherry Bodie, and on behalf of the Native and Indigenous leadership team, I would like to thank you all for joining us this morning as we celebrate Native American Heritage Month. Today's topic is about identity, and our speaker, Dr. Palermo, will be sharing his origin story as well as sharing a brief history of the Taino people of present-day Puerto Rico and other Caribbean islands. Dr. Palermo is currently a law student at Roger Williams University and is the founding president of the university's American Indian Law Student Association. He also founded the university's first and only graduate degree program in community development and serves as faculty for the program. He is the former director for the university's community development program and healthy communities program. Dr. Palermo's career as an educator, activist, and consultant spans more than 15 years. He's worked as an education and nonprofit leader, focusing on community and economic development, urban education, and neighborhood revitalization. From his work with the Newport Working Cities Challenge to the work he's done educating people about anchor institutions, Dr. Palermo has made great strides to support and advocate for underrepresented communities and urban youth. Dr. Palermo has received numerous awards for his advocacy and leadership. He's the recipient of New York State's 40 Under 40 Rising Latino Stars, National Action Network's B. Gonzalez Award, and one of Providence Journal's 11 Education Innovators to Follow. Dr. Palermo received his BA from College of Mount St. Vincent in Liberal Arts and Humanities and an MA and EDB in Business Communications and K-12 Leadership and Administration from Jones International University. He's also put together a resource list for anyone that's interested in doing more research and learning about what he's going to be presenting today. So please feel free to reach out to me and I can get you that information. So without further ado, I introduce you to Dr. Taino Palermo.
Thank you, Sherry. I appreciate the intro. Thank you to the great folks here at Red Hat, to the Native and Indigenous team for reaching out and for the opportunity to share a little bit about myself, our community, and our culture as Tainos. And so as we say, Taigwe, Hahom, Teniko, Kakona, which translates to greetings all. Thank you for having me and abundant blessings. And as they mentioned, as Sherry mentioned, beyond my academic and professional background, I also serve as the Cacique, which is Taino for chief, of the Baramaya Guainia Clan of the Taino tribal nation. That's our crest in the top left there. And in that capacity as Cacique of that band of Taino Indian tribes, I serve as the Deputy Director General for FANA, which is the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas, which is a confederacy of non-federally recognized pre-colonial tribal nations operating here in the Americas. And also, as Sherry mentioned, it is an honor and privilege to kind of package my career into advocacy for my origin story and the people from which I come from. My entire career has kind of led me to this work, and I'm excited to share some of that with you, and hopefully engage in some discussion and some dialogue. So you can go to the next screen. And so this is kind of the roadmap we're going to flow through today. I'm going to go through an introduction of the Taino culture. I'm going to talk about the attempted erasure of the Tainos through Spanish colonization, leading to American colonization, and because we're talking about American colonization, we'll be typically focusing on Boriken, or as we know today, Puerto Rico, which is the most prominent American territory that was occupied and still is inhabited by Tainos. So we will be moving to a specific Taino region in that context, but we will be referencing the entire geographic area by which we cover. And then I'll introduce some Taino scholars that you may or may not know, and also are all represented in that Google Drive with academic research and literature and publications, and anthropology studies, things like that. And then I'll wrap up with some modern day legal matters relative to Taino's rights, which I will speak personally to, as I am one of those examples. And then we'll get into questions and discussion. And so, I am an educator at heart. And so I will say that everything I am presenting to you, aside from my personal identity and origin story, is presented in facts and rooted in data and research. And I say that not to specify any type of Eurocentric specific research or journals or publications as more valid than elder histories. I'm talking about the collection of it all. Oral elder history is as valid in an international court as is a document from a medical journal or a social science journal. So I will be talking about research-based, law-based attempts to erase an indigenous community, which has led to a colonized narrative around the Tainos. So I ask that if anyone, I welcome questions, of course. I love to discuss. I don't present myself as the all-knowing purveyor of this information, but I do ask that if we are challenging anything, to do so with facts and not opinions or ideologies, because that's not what I'm presenting here, and that's a kind of separate discussion. And so, with that said, let's get into it. Go to the next slide. All right, so I say an introduction to the Tainos and not a history of, because we are not a historic peoples. We are not a past tense peoples. We are here. Our community is thriving, and we'll get into that. But I say this so that these bullets are the Cliff Notes version of our peoples. I provide a lot of resources in that Google Drive for you to take a deeper dive, but I just wanted to share some kind of real bare bones of our community in our kind of social structure. And so if you know a little bit about historical peoples, the Tainos are descendants of Arawaks, who are the original indigenous people, ancestral to Aztecs, Mayans, Incas. And so as those people spread from South America into the Caribbean region, as those societies settled over time, the Tainos occupied a predominant portion of southern Florida and the Caribbean. And historians break the Tainos down into kind of three chunks, three groups, if you will, which are the Western Taino, the Classic Taino, and the Eastern Taino. And so the Classic Taino homelands encompass Eastern Cuba, Hispaniola, which we refer to as Quisqueya, which is modern day Dominican Republic and Haiti, as well as present day Puerto Rico, which we refer to as Boriken. Hispaniola, or Quisqueya, was divided into 5 large territories comprised of 45 smaller states or chiefdoms. And so we had clearly established chiefdoms. In fact, Boriken was the largest. It had about 20 autonomous indigenous territories, and the most politically influential was Guainia, the region I am from, which we know today as the southwestern part of the island, central and southwestern, so Ponce, moving over to along the southwest coastline. And that region was led by Cacique Aguebana. Aguebana is referred to as the Cacique of Caciques, the chief of chiefs. Aguibana welcomed Christopher Columbus and early settlers. In fact, Christopher Columbus took Aguibana back to Spain to show the Queen kind of their soon-to-be triumph, which we'll get into. Western Taino people are also referred to as Siboney, spelled with a C or an S, but those are traditionally folks who lived in central Cuba, southern Florida, the Bahamas region, as well as Jamaica. Jamaica is a Taino word, Jamaica, and is a Taino homeland. And eastern Taino homelands included the Leeward Islands of the Lesser Antilles, from the Virgin Islands to Montserrat. And so we were typically structured as within two classes, as like commoners and nobles. But modern day societal structures really focus around the cacique and bohiques. Bohiques are spiritual leaders. They're like shamans. They were held in high regard as the chief. And so the cacique was responsible for the welfare of the people and oversaw the community projects and governed with a very fair and gentle hand. And as in many native cultures, Tainos are a matrilineal society. And so there were men and women chiefs, as well as children were more connected to their mothers' families than their fathers. So, and oftentimes a mother's brother, a child's uncle, had more authority and influence over a child than their own father. And so our language is in everyday use. We see these words in things like barbacoa, that's a Taino word, barbecue, hamaca, a hammock, something you want to lay in after you eat barbecue, a canoa, which is canoe, tabaco, which is tobacco, yuca, a delicious vegetable, batata, sweet potato, huracan, hurricane. These are all original Taino words, and you wouldn't know otherwise. And so one of the things Tainos did, which is common among native populations, is used a game to resolve conflicts. This game was called Batu. It was mainly ceremonial, sometimes played with bats, and a hard rubber ball. Teams of like 10 to 30 men, sometimes women played. But it was played on a rectangular court, similar to today's ball fields, and I'm going to show you one shortly. But it was often used to resolve conflicts between communities in the way stickball or lacrosse was used by mainland natives. So you see a lot of similarities between Tainos and what we know as, traditionally educated culturally about Native Americans. So we go to the next slide, please. All right, so this is a bate field. This is in Hayuya, in the middle of the island in the mountains, which was preserved. Those are original markers there, preserved by a private entity. The Commonwealth of Puerto Rico has no historical register for Taino sites, which we'll get into later on when we discuss legal matters. But so that was just a quick view. Turn that. Let's go to the next slide. So this is just a quick visual. This is one of several visuals. I don't even cite this map because there are so many different maps that essentially reflect the same thing. So the southern Florida region that Tainos occupied, if you look at most historical documentation, southern Florida is identified as strictly Seminole territory. Maybe there are some other tribes in that region, in Cherokee, probably in northern Florida, northwest Florida, but but Tainos occupied what they refer to as Bimini, which is that southern, southwest part of the state, all the way to Lucayo, which is Taino for Bahamas, and to Cubanacan, which is Cuba, as we know today, Jamaica, as we know today, Quisqueya, or as the Spaniards call it, Hispaniola, which is modern day Haiti and Dominican Republic, Boriken, often sometimes spelled with Q's or K's, and then Galingo, which is Galinago, the Carib and the Lower Antilles Islands. So this is a representation of the Western, Classic, and Eastern Taino kind of breakdown of our geographic spread. And if we go to the next slide, this is a more reflective understanding of, representation of the transnational, international kind of commercial exchanges going on between Taino tribes. And so part of the narrative we will hear about Tainos is that, that Tainos didn't really exist, is actually a common narrative, because there is so much there are so many other cultural artifacts represented throughout this region that Tainos don't really have a claim to a singular identity. And part of that is because Tainos had a nature of exchange. Taino it literally translates to good people. When people would come to the island, they would ask, Taino, that means you're a good person, and others would vouch for others in that way. And so this is so by the time Columbus and Spain had entered this region, there was already a web of interlocking networks that had spread across the Caribbean Sea. And this is a representation of those artifacts sourced, created in one region and found in another, as you could see, crossing local, regional, and pan-Caribbean boundaries. And the Spanish undoubtedly used this network to disperse rapidly through the region. And so the initial European explorations of these territories were followed by the founding of the Spanish settlements of La Navidad and La Isabela on the north coast of Quisqueya. And so that set the stage for these anchor points for European colonization of the Americas. And so this map is showing pre-colonial networks with the type of artifacts being exchanged. Go to the next slide. So Columbus lands in what he believes are the Indies, hence the name Indian that he gives the native people. And as with any proper colonization, the colonizer must establish a public narrative of those being subjugated and oppressed, or as they would say, staved, in order to convert natives to Christianity. And so, remember this new world was this quote unquote new world was colonized in the name of God and spreading Christianity during this, quote, age of discovery. So this was financed by monarchs and the Holy Church. And so public representation of oppression, the narrative needed to be spun in a way that justified these behaviors. And so above are these these two historical images are often used. This is pulled right from the Library of Congress when you are looking for these kind of quintessential images of Columbus's first discovery, first landing in this quote new world. Both of these images are kind of the landmark images used. These are in textbooks. These are all over the place. This is what we are indoctrinated when we learn about Columbus in the New World. But you see in both of these pictures, these little figures circled here, offset, smaller in stature, darker, less prominent, less light used on them. If you go to the next slide, please. I pull them out a little bit for you. Those are Tainos. That's who those are. Columbus didn't land in mainland United States. Those were Puritans. Those were English settlers. And Columbus landed here, here being the Caribbean. And those were the first contact people. Those are Tainos. They won't say that in the caption of the Library of Congress, but that's who they are. So go to the next slide. And so we have to build the public narrative. And so this is a quote from Christopher Columbus in his log to the Spanish crown as soon as he landed. This is him referring to Tainos. He says, "They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk's bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword, and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." And so this was, sounds, surprise, surprise, if you didn't know, Christopher Columbus was not a good guy, but this was a common sentiment of European colonization and supremacy. And I want you to just take a mental note of this as reflective of how you build a public narrative about indigenous people, because we'll see this in the attempted erasure when we look at the American style. But before we get to that, let's go to the next slide. Let me just give you a quick rundown of how the history of the Tainos has been distorted in order to erase their existence for political and societal, philosophical reasons. And so as soon as Spain began colonizing Taino territory, they began implementing what's known as a repartimiento system. This system consisted of straight up distributing among Spanish officials and colonists a fixed number of Indians for wage-free and forced labor. That subjugation eventually led to the Spanish crown instituting what was known as an encomienda system after several priests protested against the treatment to Indians under the previous repartimiento system, which was slavery. The terms of the encomienda system was specified that Spaniards were obliged to pay Tainos for their labor and to teach them the Christian religion. But they soon, reduced Indians to a condition of abject slavery, claiming that they were inferior, subhuman. So Indians eventually were just forced to work under, threat of corporal punishment or death. And so this subjugation led to the first known revolt of Cacique Yuro Yuan, and that was in 1510. Now, Cacique Yuro Yuan ordered his warriors to drown a Spanish conquistador by the name of Diego Salcedo. He determined whether or not the Spaniards were immortal, because you have to understand at this time they believed Spanish colonizers had divine powers, and so after they drowned Diego, they watched him for several days to make sure that he was dead. And once they were sure that he was dead, the warriors led a revolt against Spaniards. But it's documented that it was to no avail, and Ponce de Leon ordered 6,000 killed, shot on the spot in the town square. And that was a critical moment in Taino history, because it is documented that because of that revolt and that mass killing, the remaining Taino communities fled to the mountains or left the islands to go to Quisqueya or Jamaica or other Taino territories. And that's important as a critical point in Taino history, because as we see today in the mountains, as I showed you in that video, Taino culture is alive, thriving, symbols are everywhere, practices are everywhere, communities are formed and have been formed for generations. So it's important to just understand that timeline and how the diaspora has taken effect. And that has led to Cacique Enriquillo and his revolt, which led to the first ever peace treaty with the Spanish crown. Enriquillo is from what is known today as DR, Dominican Republic, and he revolted from the Spanish from 1519 to 1533 in a long rebellion, again, that resulted in that first known peace treaty. And so what we have to understand is that in particular in Quisqueya and Dominican Republic and Haiti, we often believe that the Spanish occupied that entire island, colonized that entire island, and it did not. In fact, they couldn't go beyond much more of the eastern coastline because as they moved inland and it became more, forest and rainforest and mountainous, that was Taino territory. And the Spanish did not know how to fight in those in those terrains. So Enriquillo was known to have a huge force. In fact, he had his own city as a result of this peace treaty that was eventually ransacked by free slaves maybe 10, 20 years later. And so while this is happening in the mid 1500s, Spain is underreporting census numbers to the crown. And so Spanish chroniclers wrote that all the Indians of Quisqueya were gone. In fact, following the lead of Bartolomé de las Casas. Bartolomé is the author of that book there, which is called A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, which is a book you can get on paperback. I actually have a copy. It's actually pretty cheap on Amazon. It is a historical document, a little bit performative, a little bit extreme, but it was intentional because de las Casas exaggerated the Taino population decline in order to convince the crown to abolish the encomienda system and just establish missionary villages for Indian conversion. And so these Spanish chroniclers, were also repeating what was written in a letter to the royal court by de las Casas, exaggerating their losses in Taino numbers, in death, and just killing, in order to gain sympathy for royal permission to import more African slaves. Tainos were considered to be physically inferior to the African slave who could endure the European diseases better than Tainos could. And so in order to justify importing more African slaves, the Spanish would consistently underreport in their census numbers. And so there are varying accounts of census numbers, but while there's a revolt in 1533 with Enriquillo to have said to have thousands of Taino warriors, they're saying that Hispaniola is all gone with Tainos and they need more slaves. So this was a common practice, and Bartolomé de las Casas in his book was kind of like, he was like the Edward Snowden of his time, making creating a massive leak of the savagery, ironically enough, of colonizers' treatment of Indians. And so this was the kind of structure for Spanish colonization in an attempt to erase Tainos, leading up to, go to the next slide, leading up to a series of congressional and judicial acts in the American style. And so what you have to understand, kind of going back, Spain occupied most of this region through the Caribbean region, through the select parts, through the kind of late 1800s, up until relinquishing Puerto Rico in 1899, which I'll get to in a second. So, but what you have to understand is the American approach to the treatment of indigenous people as the mainland United States is taking shape. And that entire playbook is called the Northwest Ordinance. The territorial expansion was anchored in the Northwest Ordinance, which reflected this practical ideal of political equality for territorial inhabitants. This was passed by Congress under the Jefferson administration, And the idea was that this congressional ordinance would allow the people of these new regions to form temporary governments, petition for statehood, and then be admitted on equal terms with the existing states in the Union. And so this was the playbook to be admitted to the Union as states, as the U.S. is expanding beyond the Mississippi into the western part of the country, and states are starting to take shape as settlers establish territorial governments, establish social structure, and then petition the federal government to join as a formal state. And so the catch to it all, though, is that the Northwest Ordinance presumed that the inhabitants of the territories in future states were the white European settlers settling otherwise uninhabited lands. It didn't consider any possibility of indigenous people being in these. So by the time the United States acquired Puerto Rico in 1899, the federal government had a playbook ready to implement. And I'll get to that in 1 second, but I just want to provide a little bit more context as the Northwest Ordinance provides the roadmap about how settlers can establish a territory, set up a government, join the Union. The Supreme Court is also forming the early structures of American Indian law on the mainland. And this is known as the Marshall Trilogy. And, without getting too geeky into law, what you should know at a minimum is the Marshall Trilogy were the three key Supreme Court cases in Indian law that cemented several guiding principles. First, that Congress has plenary power over all Indian affairs, which means Congress can invoke treaties with Indians, abrogate treaties with Indians, and set parameters around how Indians can exist in the United States. This Marshall Trilogy also codified that the United States owes a duty to protect the Indians, of which they have this authority over, in a way that's akin to like a common law trust. So you'll hear like Native Americans have a trust relationship with the federal government. And these three cases also establish that Indian nations retain an inherent sovereign power that's subject to divestiture only by agreement or by Congress, so by treaty again, or by Congress, who has the overall authority. And so these three court cases are Johnson v. McIntosh, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, and Worcester v. Georgia. And I'm not going to get all into them for the sake of time, but what they are all authored, the rulings and opinions are all authored by Chief Justice John Marshall. This is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest court in our land, where all things end, and that is the law, who established how the U.S. will approach Indian affairs. And so Johnson's best known, the Johnson v. McIntosh is best known for the doctrine of discovery as the origin of American property title. And so the court said that Indians could not sell their property interests, meaning the land they and generations have occupied and inhabited. They could not sell their property interests, which also the court also labeled Indian title or Aboriginal title, giving new terms to this structure. They can't sell that land to anyone but the federal government. And so in the other two cases, they codified their approach to American Indians as identifying them as not a foreign nation, but they were a domestic dependent nation. Justice Marshall says the relationship between the tribes and the United States was like that of a ward to a guardian. And so you see here how the the court is creating the narrative and establishing the social perspective of Indians in this new land under this new. These cases are in 1823, 1831, and 1832. Okay, so I'm intentionally giving you a timeline here, so you see how the approach is towards American Indians on the mainland, the approach towards territorial expansion that is absent, considering the indigenous people of these new territories, and then leading up to 1871. A couple decades later, the United States passed, Congress, passed United States Code 25, Section 71. And this law said that no tribe after 1871 was to be recognized as an independent nation with which the United States could make treaties. And so it's questionable whether Congress could actually limit the treaty-making power of the president, which is in the Constitution. But the statute did establish that reservations established after 1871 were only to be created by statute or executive order of the president. And so Congress is now, setting this parameter saying, we're not really going to recognize any other Indians after 1871. And so that sets us up for 1899 when the U.S. takes over Puerto Rico as part of the Spanish-American War. And so in 1899, they take a census, I'll show you in a second, and enumerate Tainos. They refer to them as Aborigines because they were taking over from Spanish records, which also enumerated Tainos in very few numbers, but they also, had a classification for mestizo. Mestizo was, you had one Aboriginal parent. And so they document Tainos in the 1899 census when they take an initial survey of the island. Immediately a year later, they passed the Foraker Act, which is known as an organic act. Organic acts are the kind of law that you pass when you implement a new government in a territory. That's step one in the Northwest Ordinance, is you implement an organic act. We have now planted our flag, and now we are implementing our government. And the Foraker Act was the implementation of the U.S. government and structure in the island, which means any other government, tribal conflict resolution, any type of indigenous form of conflict resolution or societal structure was dismissed and just not recognized. And then in 1910, in the census, they no longer enumerate Aborigine, but in fact changed the term native. Remember, the Northwest Ordinance was silent on natives and assumed these new inhabitants of territories were white settlers. So in 1910, I'll show you that as well, the new census redefines a Puerto Rican native and only classes them as Puerto Rican, native, white, black, mulatto, white colored or mulatto, or a Puerto Rican foreigner, somebody not born on the island. There's no other classifications beyond that. And then in 1917, the Jones Act naturalizes everyone, and everyone becomes a U.S. citizen, not recognizing any type of other tribal affiliation. And so, just go to the next page, next slide. I'll just give you examples of what I'm talking about here. Right on the census.gov historical archives, you can download the 1899 census of Puerto Rico. And this says in the section of Aborigines, Fray Inigo Abad, who was another Spanish priest who, like De las Casas, published an account on the island in 1788 and said it was as thickly populated as a beehive, referring to the number of Tainos at the time of colonization. And they go on to describe the demographics of the Tainos and their social structure. Go to the next slide. And you see a quote here in an interesting account of the Aborigines compiled by a British ambassador to Puerto Rico which is really a British ambassador to Spain, located in Puerto Rico in 1879, 20 years before the U.S. occupation. He remarks that the orders of the caciques were announced as emanating from their tutelary god, Semi, who was made to speak as desired by means of the Buhitis, meaning through, the god Semi was speaking through the shamans. And so the orders of the caciques, and so they're describing the structure of the caciques and their authority and this practice in 1879. Next slide, please. And finally, towards the end of this section, again, this document is in the Google Drive, the full document. It says in a report on August 30th, 1899, from the general who was responsible for the curation of this document and the information within it, said while work was being done on the roads, I had occasion to watch crowds of 700 or 800 men gathered about pay tables in these cities as laborers waiting to get paid. The frequency of the Aboriginal type was noticeable. While it is almost certain that there is today no single individual in Puerto Rico of pure Aboriginal stock, this is a government alluding to blood quantum as making one truly native. That's what that references to. It is equally sure that the type can be seen everywhere in the mountain settlements. Remember that critical piece of information about the massacre that led to the fled of people in the mountains. At San German, I noticed a woman whose color, hair, and features were true Indian as seen in the southwest of the United States. So this is a report of hundreds, thousands of Tainos just getting paid as laborers, not reflective of the communities they return to. And this here to the left is a picture in the report of, quote, types of Puerto Ricans. And, you can literally see the hues ranging in the spectrum of hues ranging there of the, quote unquote types. So go to the next slide, please. And this is in 1910. Now we have a census department. The 1899 census was the War Department conducting this census. Now we have created a census department under the Department of Commerce. And so before I even get into here, just you have to understand in the United States, especially this year, we saw, in 2020, the importance of the census and, how it was impacted by COVID and things like that. But that there was a big drum up for this census because how you are enumerated in a census in today's societal structure in the U.S. is it correlates to your political representation and your political power and influence, essentially. And so how people are categorized and labeled is important. And this goes back to slavery and why free slaves were 3/5 of a man because they literally outnumbered white colonizers and landowners. And so if you can, strip it, we see it today to modern day voter suppression. And so the census and political power and influence are connected. And so when you create the census and the categories, you can then try and dictate the flow of influence and political will. And so what you see here is in the 1910 census, they basically say everything categorically that we described in a prior census is null and void. This is the structure moving forward. And essentially what they say is the white population is divided into 4 groups: native parentage, with native meaning native parentage, that is having both parents born in Puerto Rico or in other territory of the U.S. It has nothing to do with indigenous blood, aboriginal blood, or anything like that. Native foreign parents, which means you were born on the island, but your parents weren't. Native mixed parents, one parent was on the island, born on the island, one wasn't. Or foreign born, you and your parents weren't born on the island. And so moving forward in 1910, there is no longer a representation or classification for Aborigine, and they now have native, meaning white Puerto Rican. And then we know several years later they naturalize everyone as Puerto Rican without any other classification. And so we'll go to the next slide. And this is just an example. So this is my third great grandmother's census. Up top is 1920, Isabel Palermo. And you see in the far right of the box, above her is her husband at the time, who is labeled as B for Blanco, white. And her kids are all MU, which is mulatto, mixed. And then 15 years later, they do away with the mulatto designation, and you're either white or black. And black was colored. And so what you see in the bottom is my third great grandmother, being, she's now white, not mulatto. And 2 rows up, right near the corner of the box, it says it's actually Ernesto Palermo. That's my grandfather, who was abandoned by his mother and raised by his grandmother. So that's Isabel Palermo, his grandmother, which is why he's the only one in the household who's colored. My grandfather is, presents as Afro, Latino, black. So you see how, identity can be skewed by the colonizing force doing your identity forming for you if you don't understand who you are, where you come from, and the importance behind these kind of documents and how you identify on a census. And so let's move to the next slide. So where are we today? I just wanted to share some faces of Tainos today, active, representing us all over the place. In the far left, you see the three caciques. That is Cacique, Guanivayu, Manicato, who is from the Bayetoa Maguayaque tribe, and they are from Quisqueya, modern-day Dominican Republic. In the middle, you see Cacique Anacaona, who is the chief of the Hatibanuku tribe. She leads the decolonizing movement of Taino narratives. A lot of things I pull is from her work, as well as the gentleman in the middle at the top. That's Jose Barrero. He's a Cuban-born American writer, journalist, and former professor of Native American Studies at Cornell University. He's a member of the Taino Nation of the Antilles, and Barrero currently serves as Assistant Director for History and Culture Research, and also directs the Office for Latin America at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. And below him is Boriken Miguel Sagüe, who is a Taino spiritual leader and the official Beike of the Taino Siboney tribe in South Florida. And to the right is Roberto Mucaro Barrero. And Roberto is a Taino activist, a Cacique of the Guainia Taino tribe. He's currently the president of the United Confederation of Taino People. And on behalf of the International Indian Treaty Council, he is the co-convener for the Indigenous Peoples Major Group on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And he represents Tainos at the United Nations. And so, I say a lot of that because we are here in America thought, treat Tainos as either they don't exist or there's some historical kind of fable. Unlike First Nations in Canada, the Aborigines in New Zealand and Australia, America is extremely late in the recognition of its territorial inhabitants and its Aboriginal communities beyond just the reservation Indians by which they forced into those agreements. So it was important to just highlight that aside from myself, we are here and we are thriving. And to that point, I'll go to the next slide. I just wanted to share some quick legal elements here. So on the left, you see a law review article by Deanna Rivera, who's the Taino academic scholar and is now an assistant professor of writing at USC. And she pursued her law degree in federal Indian policy. And so there are very few openly identified Tainos who attend law school, I can attest, let alone those who publish articles on Taino legal rights or the lack thereof. So this was an extremely exciting article for me to find, but in particular, she makes a legal argument as to how and why Tainos were denied land rights access to sacred ceremonial sites, like what I showed you in the video, that had to be, privately secured. But as with mainland native populations who when there's a development project and they uncover a mass Indian grave or there are ancient artifacts that are attributed to Native American tribes, they have a pathway to claim ceremonial land rights of which Tainos don't. And is largely attributed to the attempted erasure that I just kind of went through. So, and on the right is an active court case that I am representing myself in at the highest court here in the state of Rhode Island, and I am challenging the validity of student loan agreements signed under fraudulent misclassification as a Puerto Rican U.S. citizen and not an American Indian. Which comes with federal entitlements for Indians who pursue a post-secondary degree. And so under federal law, the government must make those entitlements known and available, but never did because Tainos were fraudulently misclassified as Puerto Ricans. And so, as I showed you in my prior slides, I am just exercising this argument in a legal setting so that we are documented in a federal courtroom that we exist here, we never left, and we want our rights. This isn't, I'm not, trying to evade my student loans, although that would be great. But this is more of the principle of the matter that there are court records, court documents at the highest court in this state, and I will appeal to the federal court if I have to, in order to make sure that our presence is known and that we are here. And luckily, I happen to be in law school to do it. I see it as my calling, and I wish to continue to push these limits on Taino recognition and appreciation in this country. And so, with that, we can go to the next slide, and I will close and leave it open for questions or comments or anything else.
Ty, can you hear me? This is Sherry.
Yes, yep.
We had some dialogue in the chat, and we actually do have a couple questions. And the first one reads, Dr. Palermo, there is this sad perception that Tainos were not as hardworking or advanced as other indigenous people in the Americas. Could you please share how we can continue to educate ourselves and others around the relevance of our Taino heritage? And I did want to let everyone know that I did share the link of the resources that you did provide us as well.
Yeah, I would say there's a Word document in there in particular that has videos and of presentations and other links that I didn't have the actual PDFs of. So I would say definitely dig through all of that, and if you still have questions, reach out to me. I'd be happy to point you in other directions, connect you to leaders. It's important for folks to identify and learn their heritage, their indigeneity, and I can guarantee you, Taino elders would be accepting and open, will accept you with open arms. So I would say dive through all of that stuff first, because I threw a lot in there, and happy to follow up and answer any questions.
And just to add to that, you did invite us to an array too. I think it was a few weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I had an opportunity to join that. So I think it's fantastic what you all are doing in the community. Like you said, everyone was very open and receptive to sharing information. So thank you for extending yourself to our wider community. Another question is, are Tainos seeking Puerto Rican statehood?
No, it's important to separate Puerto Rican independence from Taino, civility and societal existence. I mean, in the same way, the Cherokee Nation was not looking to be a part of the state of Georgia when it formed. Tainos have enough to fight about our existence and the decolonization of our of our erasure. So the statehood is a whole nother layer of an identity and a philosophy and a belief that Taino elders will tell you this as well, is separate and apart from the struggles Tainos face.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We're almost at time, and like I said, we had a lot of engagement in the chat. And one interesting thing that caught my eye is we do have a guest from Italy, and I believe this is referring to when you were going through the list of Taino words. They had mentioned that they use some of those words in Italy as well.
Oh, that's great. And hello from Italy.
All right. Well, with that, again, thank you everyone for joining us. Again, Ty, Dr. Palermo, thank you so much for joining us here at Red Hat. We've got a lot of great feedback on the presentation. People learned a lot and they appreciate you taking your time, and we'll make sure we share all that with you. But again, thank you so much. This was very informative.
Thank you. It's been an honor and a pleasure.